So now what we're going to do is talk about receipting in Razor's Edge. So I'm going to talk briefly about actually the procedure of going through mail and receipts and that, but I'm not going to be going step by step as if this were say a Blackbaud training session. What I really want to do is look at how receipting is affected by CRA policy, how to do consolidated tax receipts, especially in light of how Razor's Edge handles consolidation, and just make sure that you know what you want to do for it, just in general of receipting, consolidated receipting, and then voiding tax receipts in the Razor's Edge, and some possible procedures. I get the feeling that this, far more than the other one, there might be a little bit more variance in the room as to how different people do things, and there are different ways of doing things, say storing how you voided a tax receipt and those types of things. But I'll just talk about some practices. Doesn't mean that they're necessarily the only practice, but going to go over those. So receipt functionality. First and foremost, receipt functionality is a Canadian part of the Razor's Edge database. There is the ability to receipt in the US version, but things like receipt stacks don't exist. A lot of the receipt history pieces do not exist for the US functionality. So you will notice two things that happen with this. One, if you download the sample database and want to play with the Razor's Edge sample database either on your work computer or at home or whatever, you may notice that a lot of that receipt functionality doesn't exist. If you are in that case, you can go to the Blackbaud knowledge base. There is the Canadianizer, which will convert your database to a Canadian database, which will then allow you to do those pieces. So that's
Is it actually called the Canadianizer?
It was at one point. I don't know if it still is. But yeah, it was, yeah. Download the Canadianizer. Yeah. So that's the first thing to know, is that this is purely a Canadian piece of functionality, and there are actually different receipt functionalities depending on what country you go to. For example, UK has a bunch of other functionality for their gift aid system and so on and so forth. So this is a special piece. The second problem with that is that when you phone Charleston, South Carolina, and ask them questions about the receipt functionality, every so often you get somebody who goes, "What?" And it's because the American version of the database, which is what they are trained on, does not have this functionality. In fact, the Razor's Edge certification that I talked about earlier, when you go to the professional certification, the US version of the professional certification has the giving score, which we don't have in Canada, and the Canadian version of the certification has receipting. So it is very much a Canadian piece, and because of CRA.
So if I were to call up our friends at Blackbaud, is there a code word I should be using to make sure that they know we are talking about the same thing?
Shibboleth.
Okay, I'm going to go with that.
I don't know if you've ever seen the XKCD comic or if you read XKCD, but I'm a nerd, so I read XKCD. And there was a comic where somebody had a dream that they could get through to the smart people in tech support by saying shibboleth, which is why I say that. So.
If there is something complex, you're advised to phone twice and talk to different people. Because you may get entirely different answers if they don't solve the first time around.
It's just like the 1-800 tech support in general. Call 3 times and choose the answer you like the most.
What's really sad is when you get to the point where you go to the Razor's Edge chat help, because you can do a chat help online, and when you start to see names pop up of someone has just joined your session, you go, crap. Close, open again, get somebody else. You start to recognize the names at Blackbaud. So, but yes, definitely call again. And I know that Blackbaud is working eventually on having tiered versions of their support, so that people who, they're likely going to do it based on certification, but basically people who are certified get to a different group of people, because your questions are going to be a little bit more advanced. So. Just to be aware that, somebody might not know the Canadian functionality, you can always call back or ask to talk to somebody different. So when we talk about receipting in the Razor's Edge, what I'm going to do is kind of gloss over how to receipt in the Razor's Edge and where you are going to do that, where you go and what all the little things you have to do and think about when you're doing consolidated receipts at your end of year procedure, and then reprinting and reissuing receipts, and how to do that in 2 different locations in the Raises Edge. So the basics of receipting. First thing is receipt stacks. So we've talked about this in some of our discussion. Receipt stack is basically one group of numbers. So when you create a new receipt stack, it's going to create a whole new group of numbers. So as I mentioned here, some charities will do a new receipt stack every year. Some charities never change their receipt stack, only have one receipt stack, and just everything gets receipted to that. Some do different receipt stacks for different gifts, and this is probably the most common situation. So you will get usually a receipt stack for your normal gifts, you will get a receipt stack for your online gifts, you will do a receipt stack for perhaps certain types of event gifts. There will be different receipt stacks. Again, it's all about the serialization of those numbers. So as long as you can prove that you have receipted within that group of numbers, it's not that big of a deal. Receipt stacks are there to be able to create that sequence of numbers.
So we did something where if there's no receipt stack on the gift, we have a sequence that starts with 911, and now none of the 911s, if it ever get printed, it would never leave the office because that's how we code it. That's a 911, and that's a. Is that accurate? Yeah.
That's cool.
So some people use 9 for business receipts.
Can't you make it a mandatory fee?
I'm not sure if you can make it a mandatory field. Some of them
you can make receipt stack a mandatory field.
Yeah.
The funny situation that happens with that, of course, is when you do get receipts for, say, foundations, or when you are getting money from a charity, you do have to still put a receipt stack, and the data entry problem comes in where if somebody puts not receipted and puts a receipt stack, then it's going to go in your run. So it's just things to be aware of. If you are going to make it required, sometimes it's worth having a receipt stack for those purposes, right? This is a non-charitable tax receipt. So we will see those when businesses ask for tax receipts as well. Some charities do a business tax receipt or a non-charitable, so that it still has a receipt number, can still be tracked, but it doesn't have all the language that is needed for CRA, and those get run in those cases. So that is one option as well. You can create your receipt stacks in configuration tables. You can renumber them in your business rules. So most common scenario with that is somebody presses the yes, I want to receipt these button when they shouldn't have, and so a number of receipt numbers get generated and they're never going to go out, so people start doing global changes, reverting the receipt number. It has happened. Usually you want notes in the system to also talk about that, but you can renumber them if you want. You can also use that to change the number, so if you decide you only want one receipt stack, but you want everything for 2013 to start with 2013, you could renumber it that way if you wanted to, so it's 201130000.
You can't globally change your receipt number though, actually, right?
Yes, you can.
Ah, okay.
So,
Tip there.
so the way that you globally change receipt numbers is when you go to global change, because it's a numerical field, you can only do numerical operations on it. So you decrease it by 100%, and then it sets all of the receipt numbers to 0. And then you just globally remove anything with a receipt number of 0.
Because what I've done is imported a null character.
Yes, so you can import with a caret,
Okay. Yeah.
and that will also clear the field.
Okay.
But that's the fun trick with that
Decrease
one.
by 100%. Okay.
I would just keep them in there and make a note of
But-
why the numbers
But
were
if you
not
skipped
used.
the thing is, if you have a sequential, if you have a control number, and you don't want to skip, 400 receipts from 1999 that shouldn't have printed,
Right.
you really do want to reset it, you need to have the number set, right?
So,
We,
yeah.
we make mistakes and we just make notes of which ones.
and that's perfectly fine as well. Really it's a matter of making sure that it's all accounted for.
Yeah.
So I know when I worked with Canadian Cancer, we were dealing with tens of thousands of tax receipts, and we had for a while pre-printed numbers on them. So of course, because we weren't actually printing it on the paper, we had to revert it and do all that. So that's where the problems come in. in the Razor's Edge, you find receipts under Mail, and it is Mail Receipts, and you will get a fun little screen like this. This is where you select your receipt stack. Creating your custom data file is what you use to tell it that you want Microsoft Word to handle it. Otherwise, it's going to print it kind of the way that Blackbaud thinks that you should print it, which pretty much doesn't work for anybody. And then, like most mail functionality, you have a number of pieces, such as your include, so you can use queries. You can decide which gift amounts that you want to receipt. So if you do have a rule in-house that you only receipt over $20, you can set all of these there. So as I said, I'm not going to go into a lot of specifics with this, but this is effectively the screen where you are setting up that initial piece. You also have the ability below, and this is probably the case that you are doing, where you're doing selected receipt stacks, and then you have a simple, or you're doing selected receipt stack or no receipt stack, and having it default to the blank. If
We haven't had any 911 receipts yet, so we're waiting for the day.
So you can set it so that if there's no receipt stack on the record, that it will still receipt under this group. And so you can create as many of these or as little of these as you want. So if you actually want to have a different parameter file, that's what Blackbaud calls these, is parameter files. If you want to create a different parameter file for each type of receipt stack, you can do that. This is where consolidated receipts can be helped, because you could create a consolidated receipt stack and only do those here. We're still going to run into some of the problems I'm going to talk about in a bit, but effectively this is your receipt screen. And then as you go through the tabs, there are a number of different things you can add. The fields to include tab is going to be your export. And this is where you can actually put what information you want to send to the receipt. Razor's Edge, or Blackbaud, in their wisdom, have decided that you can only use the fields that they determine that you can use for this, which sometimes ends up being a problem, especially as we're moving to charities using the receipts to be not just the receipt but the acknowledgement letter. So a lot of charities will do an 8.5 by 14, and they will do the acknowledgement first and then the receipt below, and done with one process. And there are some fields that you simply cannot export through this. So just to be aware that you are limited to what they have. The one thing to be aware of is that there are two receipt number fields. There is printed receipt number and receipt number. Printed receipt number prints out the short description of the receipt stack as well as the number. The other just prints the number. So to give you an example, if I set my tax receipts to be, let's say I did a yearly receipt stack, so 2013 tax receipts, and I make the short description 2013 dash. If I do printed receipts, or printed receipt number, it will do 2013-1, -2, -3. Otherwise, it will do 1, 2, 3. It's better to use the printed receipt number or do something with the receipt stack, simply because if you are dealing with multiple receipt stacks, you cannot tell simply by looking at it what receipt stack you were talking about, and it's just not a good control to have. So you want to usually use printed receipt number, or receipt stack is actually a field you can bring in, so you could put that somewhere as well.
Sorry, could you just repeat that? There's the printed receipt number
and receipt number.
Receipt number.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example so it makes sense.
Please.
If you have a business receipt, then it'll say BUS and then it'll have the number. Whereas for our charitable tax receipt number, we don't have that BUS in front, but what you're saying is it might be helpful for us to have some 3-letter characters in front of that number. Because right now, the business ones say BUS in front of that, and the charitable ones have nothing in front of it. So it's exactly the same. The printed receipt number is the same as the receipt number.
And as charities are moving into electronic tax receipts, sometimes you do a separate stack for electronic, so whatever is also really beneficial. And then you can tell right away how it was receipted. The rest of the tabs are very similar to anything else in mail or reports, so I'm not going to go through each, but I will talk to each quickly. So
Can you go back one page?
Yeah.
So you see where the options button is over on the right side? And you have constituent is one of the fields that you bring over, and then when you hit options, the reason I'm bringing it up is because we have a letter and then we have a tax receipt. So what we have for constituent name is you can use the constituent name, you can use it from the individual, or you can use it from configuration. There's 3 different radio buttons. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. So there's individual, there's organization, there's from configuration.
Yeah.
Individual is going to use the addressee salutation. And basically you are picking an addressee salutation which you would like to use. One of the other options in there is full name. So full name is your first name, middle initial, last name. Your organization, you have the ability, and it's really on the org address tab where, which I might be mistaken on that one. Yeah, organization address, you can determine whether it's a contact or not. And so under organization, you can also make sure that it does put the organization for that constituent. And then from configuration is basically you're saying, you're giving it a global override. So you're basically saying that you want it to look a certain way all the time. So those are the 3 options. Now, the problem with cases where you are doing a tax receipt as well as a letter is that the options you are choosing for that are going to likely differ for where you are putting it in the letter.
Correct. So what we're doing is when you have constituent name, the first time we have addressee, the second one we have salutation, and the third one is, we call it an alternate. And so the alternate, what I'm trying to do now is to have it only use the individual radio button, because that forces the middle initial, except apparently we're still having challenges where it's an individual name versus an organization name. But so for every different parameter file, which we probably have about, I think we have about 10 different parameter files, the individual name is what CRA wants to see.
Right.
And that has to be, you have to do individual 3 times to get the third one if you're doing a mailing address, and then a friendly letter opening, and then a tax receipt. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Yes, this is the fun of Raises Edge. So what, yeah.
So the question I have in the data file now is, when we're looking at the data file, people will see the constituent ID number, but they won't actually know if it's an individual or if it's an organization without going back to check. So
Right.
I want to know if the organization name or the individual's name, because it's a doctor at a Dr. Inc. Well, who is actually supposed to receive that? Is it the doctor, the individual, or is it the doctor, the contact of the organization?
So you want key indicator, not constituent.
Yeah, effectively.
No, we never use constituent code, but when you have the Razor's Edge number, you can't see what that is.
Yeah.
And I want on the tax receipt only the name associated with constituent ID, but it's not so easy to make that link.
No.
And I was hoping you would tell me how to make that link totally clear for everybody who's using merge fields.
Yeah.
So, Tamara's a newer, higher position. I used to do so. When I was in your shoes, I had a word merge, a conditional merge. I had key indicator as an output, and I had if key indicator equals I, then if it was an individual name, I'd allow the individual name, and then if I saw corporate name, I would do CARA in front of the corporate name. If the key indicator was O for organization, I would do the company name, and then I would do attention if there was an address line. So in Word, you can control it based on the key indicator, because we have one donor actually contact us and said, I want my name on the tax. Our policy is if we have a corporate receipt, we don't do an individual contact name, because we don't want to sort of give the donor the flexibility of choosing how they're going to interpret their tax receipt. So we had one donor actually call us about this and said, well, okay, I'll put your name on it, but I'm going to put attention in front of it because I want to be really clear about what I'm doing. And so you can do key indicator conditional merge, and do attention if it's a company contact, or do CARA if it's an individual at a company address.
Well, we're not going to put the individual contact name on an organizational tax receipt at all.
Well, you could. I mean, some people will put that in the window, right? So they might want attentions that goes to that person. You can do it in Word. You can manage it.
Yeah, what you'll have to do is you actually will have to set it so that on the org address, you're always using the contact at that point, so that it outputs the contact, and the pieces it puts out is the, correct me if I'm wrong, the contact, the position, the organization name, and what ends up happening is the contact name is blank if there is no contact. So you can use that with the if then else piece to determine that as well. So not even just on the key indicator, but you can do it so that
the thing is, if you have an individual that you're mailing at their company address, you'll get a company name either way.
Right.
So without the key indicator, you're not going to know if you see a name, because the individual name will always be above, the company name will always be below.
Yeah.
Again, if you don't have a key indicator, depending on how you formatted your tax receipts, even you at the charity level are not going to be able to see from the tax receipt who the donor is. So you can do a conditional merge in Word that says, if it's a company, do attention to the person.
Right.
So that even when you're mailing them out, you know what's happening. And then you can do care of if it's...
Yeah.
I like that control.
Yeah, key indicator is going to be your best. I know there is a way to do it with the contact name, and I wish I remembered the exact way that we did it, but I remember this being a conversation at MethodWorks. About 3 of us were racking our brains one day and figured out a way to do it, but I don't have that in my head right now. But key indicator will work just fine. So the problem in general with mail in Raiser's Edge is the view that it's either a contact or it's not. There's no happy medium in Raiser's Edge land. So.
I just want the receipts to have the right, perfect data on it.
Absolutely.
And it's been a bit of an uphill every once in a while.
Yeah. I'm going to see if I can find the information we have internally on that, because I know I wrote it down somewhere. And
There's
I'll...
a formula for it, Kirk. I believe there was a formula for it that I believe we discussed and used it before. It's quite simple. So we use, like, once you're doing the mail merge, there is it if then else?
Yep.
So that's what the function is. I believe the formula is, before doing mail merge, if it's an individual use I, or otherwise, no.
Yeah.
If it's an organization, it's O. If not, then it's
When you get into the conditional mail, or into the word conditions too, you can do some really fun things by setting variables. So when you start getting into situations where you're looking at that key indicator all the time, you can do things like you can set a variable right at the beginning to say, if this is an individual, use this, and if it's an org, use this, and then call that variable throughout as well, which saves a lot of conditions later. But yeah, I'm going to see if I can find the piece that I had as well, and I'll fire it off to you so that you can post it.
Sure. It will be gobbledygook to me, but absolutely, I'd be happy to share it.
But yeah, there's a few different ways, but they're all hacks. They're really all trying to trick Raiser's Edge.
Right.
The different mail tabs, so I'll just go quickly through what these are for anybody who may not know. Gift types is like any gift types you would see in any gift report. So you basically can choose which gift types, including the pay caches, recurring gift pay caches, all those. So if you don't want recurring gifts to be on a certain receipt group, you can pull it out from there. The other pieces are very similar to any major mailing. So your filters, basically you can filter on things like fund and constituent code. Attributes, you can do 2 things with attributes, and they end up being actually really beneficial. So one is attributes you can filter based on it, so you can include records or exclude records based on the attribute. So if for some reason you mark on the record that you do not want them to receive tax receipts for whatever reason, and you do it as an attribute, you can exclude that. The other thing you can do is you can add attributes after you've gone through this mail process, and you can do it to either the constituent or the gift. So if you choose to add an attribute that it has been receipted, as much as there is a receipt flag, sometimes there's value in adding an additional piece of information. You can do that if you want to. The individual and org address are the address processing pieces. So this is where all the fun comes in with contacts. And what becomes even more fun with contacts is, and I'm sure you've encountered this, if somebody is a contact in multiple ways for an organization, then you have to kind of pick a hierarchy in general. The workaround is to create a contact attribute and use that. So basically recreate contact type as an attribute on the relationship record, and you can use that so that it always goes to the person who is the receiving person. But that is the major issue. So usually with receipts, organizations will simply do to the organization so that you're not dealing with that contact issue. But when you are doing the letter with it, it is important to have that so that it goes to the right person. Your format is your standard format tab on any mailing, any report. Basically, you have a few sort options, you have some formatting options, those types of things. E-receipts, as I said, we're not going to really go over them today, but e-receipts has a checkbox that says send as e-receipt. The fundamental problem with this is you don't get a preview. It just goes. And in fact, in the initial version that this came out, so this was released in 7.9.1, and until 7.9.1 patch 3, Blackbaud didn't really do anything proper with the Exchange server. So what would happen, and it was magical and fun, is it would basically fire off receipts, and it would start firing off these receipts, and then at some point you'd hit an email address that isn't valid. And the Exchange server would go, no, you can't email there, and it would stop the process. What's even worse is Razor's Edge only marks the records at the end of the process. So you didn't actually know who got receipted.
Like
You
where
just
it died, you have no idea.
you just know that emails went out with receipts, and you don't even know what their number was. In that.
Between
So
1 and 100 of them. Yeah.
So this is why I don't want to spend really much time on e-receipts because I could literally talk for 3 hours about how to set up your system in such a way that it's foolproof, so that when you send those out, you don't have problems. But effectively know that if you have that checkbox on and you run merge, and even if you say do not mark as receipted, it goes. So just be aware that there's some fun things with e-receipts. And that
it doesn't give you the number on the receipt or anything?
once it's done processing, it will mark the records,
Only if there's not.
but only if you've said to mark the records.
And if it completed successfully.
And if it completes.
So 2 chances.
I play Dungeons and Dragons, and even I don't want to roll those dice. Gift types can be used to restrict gift in kind. So as we said before with CRA policy, you should not be receiving gift in kind in Consolidated. So if you have a special receipt parameter file for Consolidated, you can just cut out gifts in kind and don't have a problem with that, because as you'll see in a little bit, it gets really fun when you've got people who are marked with different records. Mail merges in Razor's Edge. So we talked a little bit about conditional mail merges. There's really 2 levels of conditional. So this is the Razor's Edge side of it. So there are simple mail merges and conditional mail merges. So simple mail merge basically means that you run that receipt and everybody gets the same letter. Now within that letter you can do all of that fun if-then-else stuff in Word and be able to create effectively different language. So when I worked at Canadian Cancer, we had probably about 40 different funds because people could donate to breast cancer research or colon cancer research or whatever. And we would actually have different messaging for each of those. And rather than do it as a conditional in Razor's Edge, we just did if fund equals this, then type this. If fund equals this, then type this. And just a massive condition. But basically the simple mail merge from a Razor's Edge perspective is there is one word template and that's where it goes. This is the best thing for consolidated receipts. Because consolidated receipts, what ends up happening is a lot of gift information disappears. Razor's Edge just will not fire it off to Word. And so we have seen issues where you have conditional merges based on fund, and it's done on the Razor's Edge side. So this isn't if then else. You're actually saying, Razor's Edge, if fund is this, then do this word template. If fund is this, use this word template. Because fund doesn't get sent with it, it wouldn't run any receipts, because they're effectively your fund is blank. So your simple mail merge is your best for consolidated receipts. And again, any dynamic content, that's where you handle with the if then else. Conditions can be on multiple fields. So because you're doing the conditions in the Word template as opposed to Raiser's Edge, you can have some conditions that look at fund versus conditions that look at whether or not there's an organization name or key indicator, those types of things. So you can do all of those different things. When you get into the Raiser's Edge conditional merge, you are actually setting up multiple Word templates based on a single parameter. So if you decide that this is fund, then for all of the different funds, you are setting up different Word templates. In most cases, it does not work for Consolidated because, again, that information isn't being sent. So your letter, your fund, or some others, even receipt stack can be problematic depending on how you're running, simply because that information isn't going properly. So in those cases, you're creating templates for each value, and you have to create a catch-all in case you change something. And then it only goes over one field. So you can only do it on fund, or you can only do it on letter. So usually you will do simple mail merges and then adjust it based on what you are sending it, or you are doing multiple parameter files. So mail merges, just to go over quickly, when you put that it's going to a custom data file, you get this beautiful button that says Send to Word Merge Wizard. When you do that, you basically are processing receipts. So you actually need to have a receivable gift in order to even edit this. So I have had a lot of 1-cent gifts at organizations over the years. Once you get into Word, if you go into the final tab, which is add-ins, you will actually get all of the options for anything you've told it can have. So basically through that tab, you can very quickly pick any of the fields that you want and send it that way. Word merges are also quite fun because Word likes to change fonts. So unless you are setting up your document absolutely pure and changing the font right at the beginning, things happen. So quite often you're going back and you're adding what are called triggers to those values. So if you start playing with this and you start going into this, especially if you are dealing with multiple letters, I highly recommend you spend a few minutes looking at the triggers in Microsoft Word's help, because you will be probably doing the merge format trigger, and then you may be changing other things based on data that comes out. I had one client who wanted their tax receipts to look kind of like a check. Don't ask me why. But they wanted it so that if it was $100.05, it said $100 and ... 05 over 100. And you can do it in Word. But you're basically spending a lot of time with the actual word merge and how it's working. So once you send it to this point, you do need to do a word merge as if you were doing any other type of word merge. The nice thing is, once you build receipts in Raiser's Edge, just go merge, and it fires it off for you, assuming it's set up correctly. And then this is where the if-then-else is really nice. If-then-else is probably the most used word merge field if you were going to do any type of manipulation. So if you have special messaging. So this is also where your void receipt. If you end up putting somewhere special in your database that it voids and cancels a receipt number, this is where you can do it so that it doesn't say that unless it's actually voiding and canceling a receipt number. Or you can do it where if values don't exist, or you're doing switches based on when it's an individual versus an organization. So then you get this wonderful screen. Would you like to mark the gifts as having been receipted? And this is what we were talking about. So there's on the gift, so this is a gift record here. There is a box with a checkbox that says receipt, and that will actually give your entire receipt history. And this is also when we were talking about the issues with bringing gifts in and importing them, it doesn't throw it in there. But this is basically the locked portion. So every time you press this yes, it throws it into the database and puts it in that gift history. So just be aware, it's usually really good to test and just make sure everything is correct, and don't save that file and then rerun with actually receiving once you're good to go. So now let's get into the fun stuff. Consolidated receipts. So just kind of quickly reviewing. When can you consolidate? Cash donations can be consolidated by year. One-time receipts must be issued for gift in kind. So you cannot do gift in kind consolidated. And then because of how Razor's Edge does benefit functionality, you should not issue gifts with advantage amounts due to how Razor's Edge works. Simply because you cannot pull the actual description of the advantage, and therefore you're just editing receipts and causing problems. So anything with a benefit, and you can query that out quite quickly, anything that is a gift in kind, you should not be receiving as consolidated. Your receipt type. So this is actually on the individual record, the receipt type value. So one receipt per gift. If you were to do a receipt run, while people are marked as one receipt per gift, it will give you multiple receipts for your gifts. So if we are running receipts for me, and I'm set for one receipt per gift, and I have 3 gifts, I'm going to get 3 receipts regardless. So consolidation is not actually controlled by the receipt parameter file, it's controlled by me. It will show the individual gift amounts, it will show your campaign appeal fund, it will show your benefit information if you pull that in. Consolidated receipts, on the other hand, is 1 receipt per run. That means that if you've accidentally included gift in kind, and if you've accidentally included gifts with benefits, it's going to do it all in one go. This also means that if you're in the middle of a year and you decide to run a receipt run, and I'm set as consolidated, let's say we're 6 months into the year, if I don't filter out any other gift, it's going to consolidate all of the gifts that I've had so far and do it. Same thing with, if you don't specify the year, it's going to do it as one run. So if I accidentally have my 2012 gifts and my 2013 gifts, it's going to throw it in one run, which is not necessarily a good thing. So just be aware that when you are doing this, it's going to basically take any gifts up to that point which qualify under that parameter file, and it's going to throw it into one receipt. And then there, as I've said a few times, there is no gift-specific information. So your fund, your campaign, your appeal, none of that goes through. So if you have any messaging on your receipts based on, thank you for giving to this fund, that's not going to work anymore. If you have specific information on say the gift date, well, there is no gift date anymore because you have multiple gift dates. So just be aware that the moment you've set somebody to be consolidated, there's a number of pieces of information that don't come in.
So does that mean if I'm doing consolidated, if I have somebody set for consolidated receipts who has a gift in kind, you said I could separate out and do beforehand, so I would have to go into this file, change to one receipt, receipt is gift in kind, show it as receipted, flip back to consolidated?
And that's going to be the fun part. This field is found on the Bio 2 of Constituents, or Org 2, and that's where you can switch the receipt type. We continually ask for Blackbaud for other options, such as it would be nice to have a email receipt per gift if somebody actually requests email receipts or consolidated email. So far, we've gotten nowhere with that, but this is where you go to change that. So,
I'm sorry, can we not create an attribute for email tax receipts and then select, let's say yes, and then you make a query out of that?
Yeah, so that's usually what we've tried to do, and because you can use attributes in your mail, you can filter it on attributes. You can do things such as only include gifts with email receipt as an attribute, and then it runs it only for that group. So that's kind of been the workaround for now until Blackbaud decides to change things. In my personal opinion, I don't think receipt type should ever be on the constituent record. I think receipt type makes a lot more sense on the gift and have a default per person. But what do I know? So if you don't receipt throughout the year and you want to deal with all receipts, this is where we have to deal with the GIKs and the benefits first or after, and then deal with the consolidated separate. So that ends up creating a much more complicated procedure because, of course, it will receipt based on the constituent. So you have to do either change one per or you do global changes. So this is kind of what the procedure ends up becoming. This is assuming, of course, that you have people in your database that some are marked one receipt per, some are marked consolidated. This is very common with people or with charities who have recurring gifts because you want those to be consolidated, but you might want other gifts to be one receipt per. So basically what you're doing is obviously you're setting up your parameter file first, and then you are doing the one receipt per gift for those gifts first. So usually what we do is we do a global change on any constituent where they are marked as consolidated receipts, and you're flipping them to one receipt per gift, and then you're saving who you flipped, because you're going to end up having to revert it. So basically you make the global change, you receipt, and then you revert the records, and then you're doing the exact opposite procedure for consolidation.
Heck.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I was going to say, when we get our GIKs, or if we get from our foundation, or any of these one-offs, we change the record, and we just do that one right there and then we change it back. So we, at the year end, to consolidate, we know we're consolidating all the consolidates.
Yeah, and that effectively you're doing that on a micro scale. But yeah,
the one-offs.
And that's the fundamental problem with storing it on the constituent record is you're going through this procedure. Now, if you're more comfortable with imports than global changes, you can also do this with import, right? So that's one thing you could do is you could very quickly export out what everybody's values are, change it all to one receipt per gift, do those, change everything to consolidated, do those, import back. But you're doing basically the same information. So, you know, as we basically went through quickly, you're going through creating your parameter file, making sure that there's no gift specific fields for any of the conditional stuff. Use the year for gift date, and then you start going through your process. So we do those separately. All constituents marked as one receipt per gift. This is basically the change you are making. So you are replacing consolidated with receipt with one receipt per gift. Now there's two ways you can do a global change, or two major ways. You can either do a replace or you do an add and overwrite. Do not do the add and overwrite, because basically what will happen is it will still change everyone. So even if it was one receipt per gift on there, Raises Edge thinks, oh, I'm just adding it and overwriting anyways, and then it ends up changing every record, even though it hasn't changed every record. So make sure you're doing the replace, that way only the ones that changed will show up. So now you run your receipts. Once you're done, you revert it. So again, doing the global change, you create that query of records that were changed, and you use that to select what you're going to change this time. It's only going to select the people who were changed, and you just flip the result. And then, so you've gone through basically the first two parts. You go and flip it and do the other way. And again, I mean, nice procedure is if you can do the GIKs and benefits right away, then you're not dealing with that mess. Or if you do things such as, let's say you have recurring gifts, and you want those people to get consolidated tax receipts, what you can do is on your receipt parameter file, you do not include recurring gifts. And so you're going to not include recurring gift pay cash because those are the payments. So you don't include those, and then you set everybody to be one receipt per gift, and then when you receipt all the time, you just do it one receipt per gift, and then at end of year, you just change to consolidated for those people, and you have a different parameter file for your recurring gift. So there's a lot of different little ways that you can do it, but effectively what you are doing is you are changing the constituent record every time that you want to do consolidated. So lather, rinse, repeat, so on and so forth. And you just keep doing this in perpetuity. So again, this is where I said if you're more comfortable with import, you can use import to do the exact same function. One of the advantages of doing an import, and you might even do this even if you were going to do global changes, if you were to export all of the import IDs and receipt types, then you have a backup. So if you screw up on the global change, you at least can revert all the records back to where they were. And anytime you're doing a global change, this isn't a bad idea in general. Just having almost a CSV backup of your temporary state, because it is no fun reverting a Raises Edge database to backup. Simply because, if I've got backups happening every night, and then I've got a gift entry crew that enters hundreds of gifts during the day, I don't want to be going over there and saying, hey, I screwed up Raises Edge. Guess what you're doing? So doing a quick export of just the fields you're changing is always a good procedure. Always test first. Do not mark receipted on the first run. When you go through, quite often you'll see very, very quickly if things aren't coming through correctly. So even if you believe your parameter file is set up correctly, go through, make sure it's what you expect. Ensure that you are only receipting for 1 year. So this is where I talked about the gift date problem. Consolidated will do as many gifts as you allow it to. So make sure that you have somehow determined that it is only that year. And if you can do that in multiple places, even better. So if you have a query that says gifts only, and I guess you'd be doing it for the last calendar year, and then you put in your receipt parameter file, only last calendar year, you've at least got 2 controls in place to make sure that you don't accidentally do it. And if you only receipt once per year, it's probably best to leave constituents as consolidated and not worry about the reverting process unless you have the gifts and kinds. So I'm running out of time, and I'm sure this is boring, because I'm getting bored.
I'm just wondering if it'd be worthwhile asking if there's any questions rather than going
Yep.
to.
Yeah, I mean the slides are available anyways. So
go through a lot of content.
any questions?
Everybody's quiet. Tired.
I'm just wondering why people wouldn't just receipt as it came in, like any other transaction.
Usually it's a problem with volume. Like Canadian Cancer Society, we were doing hundreds of gifts a day. Some of my clients do 100 gifts in a year. Yeah. And so there's no point spending that extra time doing the receipting process every time. And then you do get the cases where recurring gifts, those donors don't want a gift every time they've been receipted, so there usually is some process at end of year anyways. So that's usually where the issue comes in. The other problem that comes in is the donor, right? And we're all about being donor-centric, but in the end, donors will say things like, well, I only want a tax receipt once a quarter. And then you have to, either decide as an organization if you're going to listen to the donor or if you're going to do it the way that you choose. And quite often, especially if it's a donor says, I want a tax receipt once per year, regardless of how many I give, then you've got one person at least who you have to do that for, and you make an exception for. So
we've never used it. How long does it take to set everything up, assuming that you know what you're doing?
A receipt parameter file, you basically just click new receipt, and you start up with that screen. It doesn't take long to go through the different tabs. Where your time consumption is on creating your word merge. And the fundamental problem is that some people have 2 address lines, some people have 3 address lines, things like that. So where I've found it's easiest to do stuff is to actually create one big table in a Word file and then force the height on the different areas. And that just takes time to set up. Once that's set up, though, then you can copy and paste it into another receipt parameter file. Just be aware that things like page margins or any of your page setup don't transfer over, so you will have to set those up and then you copy and paste. But you can do things like that. So once you set up the first one, as long as you're not going drastically different with them, it's pretty easy to just fire up a new one. You can also save as with the receipt parameter file. So you can simply create a new receipt parameter out of the old one and then make the adjustments as you need. So I'd say the initial one, when it comes to going through the tabs, you're spending probably 15 minutes, half an hour going through those tabs and just making sure everything is correct. The word merge, you're spending significant time on, because quite often your paper stock is going to be designed a specific way. You've got a perforation at a specific spot, you don't want information there. So that's where you're spending maybe a few hours just making sure that the adjustments are correct. Once that's done, you're good to go.
And if you were like an organization where you maybe just had some staffing turnover and like, hey, we had this Raises Edge thing and you got to do your tax receipts, Are there like people like you that can help like consult and say like, I need to get this out, and the last person just said open Razor's Edge for stuff, and you have no sort of processes?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's organizations such as ours, and obviously I'd recommend you go with us. But there are other organizations, and there's some really good consultants all throughout Canada who do this type of thing. Blackbaud does offer training. We offer training. There's a few other consultants who do training. So if you believe that you have the capacity to do it, once you know what you're doing, then you can go for some training. Usually, consolidated tax receipting, like if we were to be pulled in, we're usually talking about a few hours worth of work, and I mean it's really that is quite often, you know, there's not a parameter file set up properly, and you just have to go through, create the word merge, and do it. So you're usually not talking a lot of hours of work unless you're talking massive volume where there's a lot of differentiation.
Is there a free tutorial on the website how to set up all these?
There, with Blackbaud, you will have access to the knowledge base. So that would be the first place. So the knowledge base, and they have Razor's Edge manuals. So that's going to be where you can actually go through step by step.
The other thing too is to tie up their support lines on these questions, and also to complain bitterly to the sales reps about what is essentially a broken process within their software for Canadian organizations.
Exactly. Had some activists in the room.
Because when you do those two things, that's the only way anything ever cycles up with them. Because they keep track of it all in the database. If you tie up the call longer on a specific subject, those things will surface because it erodes into the profitability of the call center.
So if I call and just say that I need help for the Canadian version, they won't have someone who's ready, trained for that to help?
Not necessarily, but they'll be able to guide you through, and
just be
might get
really,
a screen share.
Agrimonious with them, and just say, if you don't know, please escalate it right now. And also use the line, just go down the hall and get someone from development. Is always a good line.
Thank you.
So there are other magic words.
Yeah, Blackbaud also has I call it bug fixing by democracy. They have a user voice center where you can say, I need this changed. And like any massive software company, you have to understand, Blackbaud's assets are $700 million. This is not a small company. They have 2,600 employees. So they're basically, when you go in and say, I have this problem, Blackbaud will go, well, nobody else we've talked to has this problem. And they kind of brush you off.
They always.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you always say that with me too. They always say that.
Oh, this is the first time we've heard that.
No one ever
it's
had any
not.
problems. Yeah.
I have a fun story about that. I found a database architecture problem, and they told me I was the only client that had a problem with it. It's a problem with your architecture. You need to talk to your programmers now. But yeah, so anything you can do like that on the phone, going through the user voice, bothering high up people if you can find names. Jennifer Mercer is the Razor's Edge lead now, so she would be the person to bother if something becomes a problem as well. And I will admit that Blackbaud has gotten a lot better and more responsive over the last 2 years. It's not where it should be, but they actually decided as a corporate strategy not to be the company that just acquires anymore. They actually went back to development. This is why Bluebird is coming back out into...
But then they acquired Conveo within the last 2 years, so it's not quite true.
Yeah.
Plus their CEO got fired for whatever reason. Customer support is terrible. It's even worse than Microsoft.
Agreed. So.
Wow, you guys make me want to buy it.
It is good. It is good.
What was your line?
Well, I used the Churchill line about democracy, right? The old Churchill line was democracy is the worst system unless compared to everything else that's been tried.
Actually, Aristotle said it first.
Oh, was it Aristotle?
Yeah.
Even better. But that's the way I feel about Razor's Edge. Razor's Edge is the absolute worst software in our industry, except when you compare it to the other options you have. Right? It's used by 26,000 charities. It at least has some strength behind it. There was some smart architecture back in the day on it, but it's it was built in '99. The Razor's Edge 7 has been around for 15 years. It's
We had GiftWorks. Oh, it was terrible. So, yeah, I love Razor's Edge, honestly. The reports I can pull out, give to our board members or anything to our donors, I find it's amazing. For me, it's working.
We have an access database and inconsistent filling it out.
Data entry is always going to be a problem. One of the advantages of Razor's Edge is you have the ability to do queries on your data that you wouldn't access as well, but it's far easier to generate them in Razor's Edge. So you have the ability to create QA queries. And there have been some good talks actually at the Blackbaud conferences over the years about quality assurance queries, what you should be looking for. When I was at Cancer, I used to have a query called the zombie query. And it was people who were marked as active volunteers but were also deceased. Right?
Awesome.
So, you get these data entry problems and you just need ways of fleshing them out, and that's the way you do it. You had a question, comment?
Yes, you mentioned that you've taken all the certification courses, or at least the ones that are available right now. At what level of certification is at least some of the content addressed? The beginner or the intermediate?
This content would be on the professional level.
Professional. Is that the one that currently is not offered? Or
No, that's the middle level.
That's the middle?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the associate level for certification is really your navigating the Razor's Edge, batch entry, understanding constituent records, understanding gift records. Professional level is all of the modules, mail, reports, query. And then the master level is going to be administration, configuration, crystal reports.
Sorry, the last one again.
Administration, configuration,
config,
crystal reports, and then I'm not sure what else.
Yeah, I know.
It's they're supposed to start beta testing in the next few weeks. Because I've been beta testing with them, I'll probably get notification the next few weeks that I've got a test date. So,
and how did you find the tests in the first two?
Personally, the associate exam took me less than an hour, and I cleared it. I have talked to a few clients now who have taken the test twice. You get 2 attempts. They've taken the test twice and failed both times, but they've used Razor's Edge for less than a year. So I'm kind of getting the feeling that if you've used it for 2 to 3 years for data entry, or you are in it pretty much all day, every day for data entry for a year, you probably can make it through the associate. Professional, last count, there were only 9 people at the professional level who were not Blackbaud employees. So it's significantly more difficult. That one took me 3 hours, and I failed the first time.
What did you get the first time?
You failed the first
78. And you need 80 to pass.
And what was it about it that was so tough?
It was actually a lot of the mail functionality, and a lot of it was...
Query list.
Oh.
Well, I find the professional query list is a big section.
Yeah.
And if you haven't started using it in the version, then you're floundering there. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, oh, they really mean it's available. I actually didn't realize it was available, and I've been using the right version for a few months, and then I'm like, that's what they're talking about.
Yeah,
I'm
query.
a little late to
I hate query list. Bill Connors and I have had some fun discussions with Blackbaud about it. But the mail functionality is actually what got me, and it's because I didn't spend the time on each question that I should have. And so it's things like, the mail is run on this date, and this person is at their seasonal home on these dates, and this person has this attribute, and they have this gift type, and your filters are this. And, I mean, by the end of the question, you're going, I don't even remember what the first part was. So, definitely there were those issues where you actually really have to spend time on each question. What really helps with the test taking is there's the ability to mark for later. And really it comes down to, if you start taking too long in each question, just mark for later and finish what you can and then go back to those. Because that test, I know people who have gone right up to the final point
So we can download the trial version and see if this is for us or not.
That you'll have to talk to Blackbaud
You can
about.
get a sample of 10 questions online, and if you are comfortable with 10 questions.
No, not for the test.
The-
I
the
want to
software?
write The software.
The software, you'd have to talk to Blackbaud. There is a sample database that they probably will grant you.
I'll do
Oh, it's
anything-
not like any
anything
software,
that,
you can
you
try
want
it?
pre-sale.
You are, yeah, that's true.
To get through sales.
But Blackbaud, yeah,
You're
Black-
really making us love this company.
Blackbaud will tell you that it can make toast.
No, but I'd like
So
to.
get past the initial
So what
sales.
I'm curious about, if we do get that sample and we play around with it with some made up receipts or whatever, after that, if we go to the paid version, will it install over the trial or could we just
No, so
start over?
so every database has a special serial number. The sample database has its own serial number, so it
That would be, so you can just play with it and just see.
yeah. And I mean, on my personal computer for work, there have been times where I've had 15 Raises Edge databases on at one time.
Oh, and would you say that importing online donations is problematic because?
Depends on the situation.
Depends if you're using that.
If you are looking at high volume, Importomatic is pretty much a required
For example, if you have
program.
a PayPal button on a website or something like that.
You can import them in, but the receipt number will not write into the Raises Edge the same way as it would if you were to run it through the Raises Edge. And then when you start getting into volume, you probably want to use a program like Importomatic. The import functionality is touchy. You cannot import constituents and GIFs at the same time.
In a program called Importomatic.
Importomatic will let you do it.
Fix that.
Yeah. So Importomatic was built by an engineer who left Blackbaud, and this happens a lot. So they left Blackbaud and he built this product which basically makes it really easy to import in.
So if I ever go that way, we could put that and make it easier to import the receipt number.
They're coming to speak at one of our user groups later on this year.
I'm
We're
not
just
that
having-
excited about the topic, but I don't think anyone
Informatic
should
software
be.
is?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
do-
have Net Community coming. There's a lady named Lisa Lane from Seattle. She's coming up.
Oh yeah, from Beyond Nights.
Yeah.
Yep.
She's coming up on March 20th, and then we're going to decide whether it's May or September when Importomatic is coming, because Blackbaud wants to come back to do the suite of Luminate that they weren't able to present.
Yeah, they need to
find
do-
out more about these events. Where would I go to RSVP?
Meetup.
Interesting.
Well, you know what? We'll send you a link, and you can send it to your 1800.
Genius.
Yeah.
Genius.
That's okay.
We'll talk about that.
Oh, good.
Sorry?
Well, if that's it, I'll be around for a little bit.
Thank you so much.
Can answer questions. Oh,
Just on
Yeah,
your
I'm
work
working on the
machines,
associate.
are you using VMware or something to set up Razor's Edge on your work machine?
No.
So we're just installing it directly. In a production environment where you have to also connect your live database, can you do it within VMware?
absolutely.
Yeah,
In fact, I had one client who we set up a whole test environment of Net Community and Raises Edge on one VM network. So
Awesome. Well, folks, thank you so much for being part of this today. They're deep into the conversation already. Anyways, one more time. This is our guy Kirk. He's smart. Give it up. And as I said, we'll have the slides and some resources available post event. And also corner him now. You've got the next couple minutes.